Namaskar, dear learners. In this lecture, we will discuss about the need for a separate theory of international trade. So, in our previous lecture, we have discussed the different unique features of international trade, such as immobility of factors of production, immobility of final products, heterogeneous market, the problem of balance of trade, the problems of different rules, regulation, etc. That implies that international trade is different from inter-regional trade. Now, to analyze the different aspects and the nature of international trade, we need certain theories. It is also true that there are certain theories which basically deals with inter-regional trade. Now the question arises whether we need for a separate theory of international trade, because international trade is completely or or partially different from inter-regional trade. Now we'll start with introduction. What happens in a world where countries are increasingly interconnected, the exchange of goods and service and capital across borders had become a cornerstone of economic growth and development. So that is why we need to have a trade between countries so that we are interconnected. However, while trade within a single country operates under certain principle, trade between nations is far more complex. As a result, it requires own set of theories to deal with international trade and to understand the dynamics of international trade. The need for a separate theory of international trade arises for various reasons, such as differences in economic environment, policies, and institutions among nations, as well as the unique features that influence the cross-border exchanges. So that is why this lecture is basically designed to explore why international trade requires own theoretical framework distinct from domestic trade theories. Now, to understand why international trade requires a different set of theories as compared to inter-regional trade, we have to understand the basics of domestic and international trade. Now, what happens? Domestic trade basically occurs within the boundary of a single country, where factors of production such as labor, capital, and resources are relatively more mobile as compared to international trade, and along with that, the participant of domestic trade operate under a unified legal, monetary, and regulatory system. So this is not the case with international trade. So in contrast to that, what happened? International trade involves the exchange of goods and services and investment between different countries with different political, legal, economic, and cultural system. So to involve in international trade, the producer has to accustom with those rules, those regulation, those legal framework. So that is why to study international trade, we need more sophisticated theories, which by inclusion of those distinct political, legal, and economic and cultural differences between different countries. So basically, in economic theories, the price is determined basically by supply and demand. That is why while the principle of supply and demand govern both domestic and international trade, but several unique factors make the international trade far more complicated, requiring a separate set of theories to explain and to predict the trade pattern and outcome. Now, the most important difference is the difference in national economic policies, which so due to differences in national economic policies among the countries, and each country has an own set of policies which reflect their own priorities, which reflect their own interest. Now, if we use the same set of theories which define the inter-regional trade, then what will happen? And those theories will not able to capture those complexities which arises due to differences in national economic policies. For example, within a single country, where uniform set of fiscal, monetary, and regulatory policies govern economic activity, each nation in international trade has its own policies. For instance, government may impose tariff, quotas, subsidies to protect domestic industries and also to pursue strategic economic interests. So those things are not in interregional trade. So that is why the theories which define interregional trade is quite different to that of international trade. The amount of sophistication required in international trade is comparatively more as compared to inter-regional trade. So that is why the differences in national economic policies can create barriers to trade that do not exist in domestic market. So for example, the trade war between United States and China involved tariff and counter trade, so which ultimately disrupted the global supply chain and lead to changes in the trade pattern. So ultimately, the understanding such phenomena requires specialized theory that goes beyond the scope of domestic economics. Another important issue why we need a separate theory of international trade is the exchange rate and currency differences. So one of the important significant difference between domestic and international trade is the use of multiple currencies. So exchange rate fluctuate based on factors like interest rate, inflation, and political instability. So these are considered to be the most important factors which have directly impact on exchange rate. So ultimately, when the changes in these economic variables has an impact on international trade, it creates uncertainties and risks that are not present in the domestic trade. For example, a depreciation of Japanese yen can make Japanese export cheaper and more competitive internationally, but has no impact on domestic trade within Japan. So that is why a separate theory is needed to account for such exchange rate, to study the effect of exchange rate on trade flows and competitiveness. Now, we need to discuss in details how change in interest rate has an effect on exchange rate, which ultimately have an effect on volume of international trade. So what generally happens, high interest rate in a country generally attract foreign capital as investors seek better return on investment, which increases demand for that country's currency, leading to an appreciation in its value. So conversely, what happens? Lower interest rate make a currency less attractive to investors, resulting in reduced demand and a depreciation in its value. So this is how interest rate has an impact on exchange rate. Similarly, the another important variable is the inflation rate. What happens in case of inflation rate? Lower inflation rate in a country are often associated with stronger currency because purchasing power remains stable, making its goods and services more attractive to foreign buyers. On the other hand, what happens? High inflation erodes the purchasing power of a currency, leading to depreciation. So this is because investors prefer to hold currencies that retain their value over time. Because of inflation, what happens? Inflation expectation can also influence exchange rate. If markets anticipate future inflation due to policy changes or economic condition, the currency may weaken even before inflation actually rises. This is another way of how inflation affects the exchange rate. Now, the political and economic environment also affect the exchange rate indirectly, because countries with stable government and predictable policies are more attractive to foreign investors, leading to influx of capital and consequently the appreciation of the currency. The reverse is the case when we don't have a stable government and an unpredictable kind of policies. then what will happen? Those countries are not attractive to foreign investor, so leading to fall in capital and consequently depreciation of the currencies. Now, what kind of political instability we are talking about? We are talking about political instability such as frequent election, conflict, sudden policy change. So those are the political instability which can lead to loss of investor confidence, promoting capital flight and causing the currency to depreciate. Even geopolitical tension or changes in leadership can cause significant volatility as investor may fear economic disruption or policy uncertainty. So that is why to capture all those factors which are not so important in case of interregional trade are very much in international trade, which necessitated a separate theory of international trade. Another important factor that is which we have slightly covered in our previous lectures, that immobility of factors of production that also create the necessity to have a separate theory of international trade, because in case of interregional trade also factors of production are not perfectly mobile, but the thing is that the extent of mobility or in a relative sense, if we examine the mobility of factors of production in interregional trade, it's much more than of international trade. Now, if we develop some kind of theories, or if we try to explain international trade in terms of those theories which basically accustomed to deal with domestic trade, the predictability of those theories, the applicability of those theories will be very less. So that is why we need a separate kind of theories for explaining international trade. So in domestic trade, what happens? The factors of production like labor, capital can move relatively freely across region within a country. The advantage of those countries and necessary theories that take into account the factor immobility. The consumer preferences and the kind of market also requires a separate theory for international trade. We cannot expect that each country has a set of preferences for same set of goods. The preferences of the consumer in different countries are of different, and accordingly those countries, the markets of those countries try to capture the preferences of their customer or consumers. And as a result, what happens in international trade also, the producer producing those goods, they have to capture those differences in preferences of the consumer, because countries differ not in their resources and capabilities, but also in their consumer preferences, cultural norms, and social practices. It happens that a product that is popular, very popular in one country, may not find the same demand in another due to cultural differences or other differences which influence trade pattern. For example, the demand for a particular good may be very high in say many Western countries, but that particular product, for example, product A is the demand for product A is very high in say Western countries, but the demand for that product is virtually non-existent in some of the countries. So this kind of variation of preferences, how to capture this kind of variation of preferences? So for capturing those kind of variation and preferences, we need to have a different set of theories. So that is why it is said that the change in consumer preferences and a different kind of market requires theories that consider non-economic factors in international trade, because these factors are not so economic, they are all considered as non-economic, but these factors has an impact on international trade, and that is why we need to discuss those theories in details. Generally, what happens when trade occurs, particularly in domestic circle, it is largely governed by economic consideration. But international, if you see the international trade, along with the economic consideration, there are some of the things which are very much political, because international trade is heavily influenced by political relationship, diplomatic ties, and national security concern. Suppose if I consider two countries, say country A and country B. Now, from economic point of view, it is necessary that suppose country A is a good in country A has a comparative advantage in a particular good, and country B has a comparative advantage in another good. So they can easily trade and take the advantage of comparative advantage. But in most of the situation, or many of the situations, what it happens, they may not have a very cordial relationship between the two. They may have some kind of tensions. So as a result, what they happen, due to the political or constraint, or no, you can say political volatility, because they don't have any kind of diplomatic ties, and they have, they consider each other as an enemy. So that is why they are not so interested in trading between the two countries. So that is why, although both of them can take advantage by trading by involving international trade, but due to political consideration, there may not be any kind of trade between the two countries, in spite of having economic advantage in terms of comparative advantage. So that is why, political consideration is very important. Political consideration or political and social factors are very important in international trade. So it is a very important variable. So that is why, for explaining, for developing any kind of theories, for developing any kind of model in international trade, we need to have, consider political and social factors as one of the important variables. Otherwise, those model will not be efficient enough to explain the international trade, and the predictability of those model or theories will be very less. And as a result, what happens, in spite of having comparative advantage, or in some cases absolute advantage also between the two countries, the government may impose trade restriction not for economic reasons, but to achieve political and strategic objective. For example, we can give the example of sanction imposed on countries like Russia and Iran, restrict their ability to engage in international trade regardless of their economic efficiency, because Russia is considered to be one of the countries having highest amount of efficiency, but due to some political consideration, sanction imposed on them, and they cannot engage in international trade in a free manner. So this kind of intersection, this kind of politics and social factors, this requires or necessitate a distinct theoretical approach that will include the political and social factors as important consideration while developing those kind of theories. Now, if you see the historical development of international trade theories, the theories of international trade have evolved over centuries to address those complexities, as I have already discussed, which are unique to cross-border exchanges. For example, if you give the example of mercantilism, between 16th to 18th century, the early trade theories like mercantilism emphasized the maximizing export and minimizing import to accumulate wealth. To their view, however, was later criticized by zero-sum perspective considered as a zero-sum perspective on trade. Now, if you see the classical trade theories, economics like Adam Smith, which is credited for developing the theory of absolute advantage, David Ricardo, they introduced the concept of absolute advantage and comparative advantage, which explain how countries benefit from specializing goods where they are most efficient. So that is why both mercantilism and classical economics, they develop the different sets of theories which basically explains the international trade. They try to those theories try to capture the dynamics or differences of international trade to that of interregional trade. Modern theories also in the 20th century, theories such as Hexer-Orlin model and new trade theory expanded the classical theories by incorporating the factors like differences in resource and economics of scale. So these theories addresses more complex aspects of international trade such as factor enrollment, technological differences and differences between countries. So we will not go in detail about these theories in this lecture because it is not possible. And so the details of those theories one by one will be dealt with our subsequent lectures on this part. Now we'll try to see the role of global institutions in shaping international trade, because in case of interregional trade, the government of the particular country will regulate the rules. They don't have to abide by the rules of the global institution. But in case of international trade, the countries who involved in international trade, they have to abide those rules. And as a result, it creates another layer of complexity in case of international trade. So that is why while developing any kind of model or any kind of theories, we have to include the role of global institution in shaping international trade, because the international trade is further complicated by the presence of global institutions like World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, and various regional trade agreement, the European Union, etc. So these institutions definitely play a role in regulating trade practices in international trade. They also play a significant role in resolve dispute related to international trade and promoting trade liberalization. Addressing, they try to address another, but the problem is that it will create another layer of complexity to the study of international trade. These are domestic trade theories. Any kind of model, any kind of theory that try to explain domestic trade do not need to account for such institutions, because they are typically no equivalent organization governing trade within a single country. So thus, the existence of international regulatory body necessitate the specialized theory to understand their impact of global trade dynamics. Because in interregional trade, whatever trade theories we have, whatever model related to trade we have, this basically we need not have to give much importance on the role of the global institution. It is the government who is regulate the domestic trade. But this is not the case in international trade. So that is why in international trade we cannot ignore the role of the global institution in shaping international trade. So that is why what we have learned up to this part is that in case of international trade, the rules, regulation, the features are quite different and slightly complicated as compared to interregional trade. So these complexities of international trade, driven by differences in national policies, currencies, factor immobility, cultural preferences, and political consideration, create a landscape that is fundamentally different from that of domestic trade. So as a result, what happened? Economics has argued for a separate theoretical framework for international trade, and from our for whatever discussion we have already made, we can say that we need a separate theoretical framework which is essential to analyze and predict trade pattern in international trade. This is because it also helps to understand the effect of government intervention and government of different countries and their intervention, and to assess the impact of global economic integration. So that is why, while theories of domestic trade are useful in understanding exchanges within a country's border, they significantly fall short in explaining the intricacies of international trade. So now if you use the same kind of model, same kind of theories to explain international trade as we used to explain the domestic trade, those kind of theories become irrelevant, and they are not efficient enough to explain international trade. So that is why there is a need for a separate kind of theories, and that is why from if you see the different kind of theories which explain international trade, both classical, modern, even the mercantilism which I have already referred, they always consider international trade as a separate kind of uh, entity as compared to domestic trade. So the need for a specialized set of theories is therefore it is critical to navigating the challenges and opportunities presented by the global economy. Otherwise, it cannot ensure that those theories will predict the dynamics of international trade. So there is urgent need to ensure that the countries that involved in international trade can make informed decisions to enhance their economic well-being in a complex, interconnected world. Now the thing is that those theories will guide those countries and businesses how to involve, and how to do trade in international area. So until and unless we have a separate kind of theories, until and unless we have a set of theories and model which explain international trade by considering which are not so prominent in case of domestic trade, those kind of theories cannot explain international trade. So considering the above factors, such as the role of global institution in shaping international trade, historical development of international trade theories, differences in political and social factors, uh, lack of homogeneity of market, lack of consumer preferences, that is consumer preferences are different, immobility of factors of production, immobility of product, currency differences, which ultimately affect in exchange rate in terms of higher interest rate, in terms of interest rate, inflation, and other factors, differences in national economic policies. So there are lots of differences in international trade as compared to interregional trade. So if we consider all the factors, what we can conclude that we need a different set of theories for international trade, which will capture those differences, those unique features of international